They didn't know what graffiti meant in those days. But
wait. We can't let that pass. No. They really didn't understand what the word graffiti meant.
They didn't. The studio executives generally are not the most sophisticated people in the world. And you will find that if you go to Hollywood. I hope you don't, because you don't want to be oppressed by people who are not as smart as you are. And I'm dumb.
But you know what graffiti meant.
Yeah. And it perfectly summed up what the movie was. They said it was, not about anything. There was no story. You couldn't tell 4 different stories and cut them up like that to where you intercut them and they weren't related to each other. They said that was impossible. They said you couldn't put that much music in a movie. It was just, you can't just have a music track going through the whole thing. There were a lot of issues that were very controversial at the time that kept it from being made. They looked at the stories and they said, we want to make something for the fans.
There is no Star Wars without George Lucas. Everything that makes Star Wars great, the story, the mythology, the characters, the worlds, all of it comes from Lucas, and everyone who worked with him on his films knows that and wants you to know it too. In my prior videos on Star Wars, when I talk about this and place the contributions of his creative partners in the proper context, this is ultimately what I'm getting at. The films are, always have been, and always will be Lucas's films. I talk about this and I find myself compelled to repeatedly make that clear because from my observations of various parts of the Star Wars fandom, as well as my observations of the post-George Lucas era of the franchise, it's evident that there are still a great many people who have yet to accept this as the truth. The mental gymnastics that people have to perform to simultaneously love Star Wars but hate George Lucas is rather impressive, separated from the inherent bad faith of doing such gymnastics at all.
I just believed in him and his genius. I sort of recognized off of American Graffiti that he really was a genius.
It's a matter of getting in sync with George, and I hope that I've kind of gotten in sync with George on this film.
I'd like to, of course, thank George Lucas, who had all the great ideas and provided all the inspiration for the things in Star Wars. Thank you very much.
And last but most significantly, we had a director who, apart from his many other obvious talents, is himself a fine editor, George Lucas.
George didn't win director. Well, that made me sad. If ever there was somebody who deserved a directing award, it was George Lucas for Star Wars.
I quoted Michael Kaminsky's Secret History of Star Wars blog a few times in my video on Marsha Lucas, but it and the book of the same name that Kaminsky wrote are a perfect example of this phenomenon. It's thousands upon thousands of words that try to attribute everything successful about Star Wars to anyone besides Lucas. There really isn't any comparable situation in film history where one person has been able to tell a story of this scope over such a vast amount of time and maintain complete creative control the entire time. And yet, certain people are just wholly disinterested in studying and understanding his creative process and why his movies are the way that they are. There's a paragraph in Kaminsky's book where he tries to drag Lucas for his supposedly awful dialogue, and it's the perfect microcosm of how myopic this way of thinking is. He scrutinizes a line from an early draft of the Empire Strikes Back screenplay written by Lucas, in which Han says to Leia, "Don't worry, I'm not going to kiss you here. You see, I'm quite selfish about my pleasure, and it wouldn't be much fun for me now." Shades of Attack of the Clones, Kaminsky says. Had this been filmed, critics might be lashing the poor scripting of Empire, but somehow Empire ended up evolving into another first-rate screenplay. How did that happen? How did lightning not only strike twice, but arguably produce a better crafted script than the original? The answer comes with the relinquishing of control Lucas enacted, allowing his screenplay draft to be transformed into something far beyond any abilities he had on his own. Since Kaminsky purports to be uncovering the secrets of Star Wars history, you'd think he'd have realized that Lucas was copying a line from Gone with the Wind, and this is by no means the only instance of Lucas lifting lines from that book for Han and Leia's dialogue. This becomes significant in the context of examining the original trilogy and comparing it to the prequels, as Kaminsky is trying to do, because Lucas uses a similar process of homaging a great romance novel in Attack of the Clones, taking many of Anakin and Padme's interactions from Dr. Zhivago. This isn't really secret history, even. It's right there on the posters.
Come on, admit it. Sometimes you think I'm all right.
Occasionally, maybe. When you aren't acting like a scoundrel.
Scoundrel? Scoundrel? I like the sound of that. You like me because I'm a scoundrel. There aren't enough scoundrels in your life.
I happen to like nice men.
Nice man.
Very nice.
My heart is beating, hoping that that kiss will not become a scar. You are in my very soul, tormenting me.
I truly, deeply love you.
So if one finds themselves responding differently to the love story in the prequel trilogy than they did to its counterpart in the original trilogy, that's a valid initial reaction to have, but from there, if one wishes, they can examine the dialogue a bit and compare it to the sources of inspiration that Lucas used, and upon doing that, they'll understand that it was the same creative process that led to both stories. One might then see the films in a new light and appreciate his art more. Kaminsky takes the first step of doing this with his singling out this line, but the full thought process I just outlined here necessitates that one acknowledges that maybe Lucas knows something they don't. Kaminsky doesn't do that. And this is just one paragraph of one book from one author, but it's the same flaw as the Plinkett reviews, and it's how a lot of analysis of Lucas's Star Wars goes. I've also used a few clips from Alexander Philippe's documentary, The People vs. George Lucas, in these Star Wars videos as well. It features dozens of people like this who just can't get past how anything that evokes memories of the prequel trilogy feels like a blight on the purity of the original films. We can see how this form of critical analysis limits one's ability to evaluate other aspects of these films as films.
Further, the prequel films often have overly wooden acting, boring blocking, and unnecessary usage of CGI.
Right, Jesse is using this clip from the scene where Anakin tells Padme about his premonitions of his mother's possible death as her prominent example of the prequel's, quote, boring blocking. Now, despite her best efforts to convince me otherwise, I still believe that Jessie knows a thing or two about the art of editing, so she likely selected this clip with deliberation, showcasing it as the nadir of the supposed uninteresting staging, the limp shot design, the purposeless scene direction, the boring blocking that draws her ire. Let us now evaluate the scene itself and study with a greater degree of nuance what merit the staging and direction of this scene have to offer. The scene starts with a shot of the clouds in the sky forming a Taijitu, a yin-yang, which, of course, is a symbol that often represents the coexistence of opposites, or dyadic relationships between opposing forces. It appears in the sky here during the sunrise of a new day, and the soft lighting on Anakin's front, the symmetrical architecture of the veranda here, and Anakin's reflection on the reflective flooring here are all being presented together to get you thinking about these broad concepts of reflections and opposites, the harmony and balance between it all, that kind of thing. And the first wide shot of Anakin is also asymmetrical, but then even as we move the camera in to have a more symmetrical framing of Anakin right in center frame with the pillars on either side of him, Padme's presence throws off that symmetry, and they're divided by one of the pillars here, which is also obscuring the Taijitu. So already just in these shots setting the scene before their conversation really starts, we have a lot going on thematically, and from there we cut to the shot that draws Jesse's ire of Anakin positioned closer to the camera, turned away from Padme, who occupies the dark, noisy, earthy half of the frame while Anakin is illuminated by the bright morning sunrise, and Anakin speaks about her presence feeling soothing. Now admittedly, so far I've been speaking about everything except the blocking itself, but the thing about film as a visual medium is that studying it should be more about seeing how these elements of lighting and set design and the intercutting between shots work together as a cohesive whole. Blocking is only one element of this synergy, and especially in the case of Star Wars, where Lucas is always quite vocal about the importance he places upon these other elements, it's important to understand how they're working together and what they're making you think and feel when appraising the artistic success of the film. So once Padme gets Anakin talking about his dream, he begins to open up about his visions of his mother's suffering, and he opens his eyes coming out of the unconscious world into the conscious one, and as he relates his visions to her, he steps away, widening the distance between them before voicing his abandonment of his responsibility as a Jedi to satiate his desire to save her. And while his intentions appear honorable as he first gives voice to them, we're going to see in the scenes to come that the true inner torment he feels over this crisis is one of personal desire for the power to save whomever he feels attachment to, and of inability to accept the natural cycle of life and death. And all of that is also being subtly foreshadowed with Anakin implying his own feeling of lacking power.
I don't want things to change.
I will do anything that you ask.
I'm sorry, I don't have a choice. I will do whatever you ask.
You turned her against me!
Another element that I find it valuable to consider is that this scene that opens with the aforementioned Taijitu is set at the structural midpoint of the film, and really this scene is the structural midpoint of all three films in the trilogy. This scene of Anakin turning away from his responsibilities as a Jedi to give in to his attachments.
I will come back and free you, Mom. I promise.
disobeying my mandate to protect you, Senator. But I have to go. I have to help her.
What are you gonna do?
I will not betray the Republic. My loyalties lie with the Chancellor, and with the Senate, and with you.
I want to come with you to Alderaan. There's nothing for me here now. I want to learn the ways of the Force and become a Jedi like my father.
If you end your training now, if you choose the quick and easy path, as Vader did, you will become an agent of evil. Patience.
And sacrifice Han and Leia.
If you honor what they fight for, yes.
If you choose to face Vader, you will do it alone. I cannot interfere.
I understand.
But why must you confront him?
Because there is good in him. I felt it. He won't turn me over to the Emperor. I can save him. I can turn him back to the good side. I have to try.
There is a high degree of overlap between all these scenes when it comes to broad thematic strokes and what is emotionally driving the characters, but what sets them apart and makes them unique to their respective episodes is what environment they're set in to tell you something about where each of the trilogy's respective Skywalkers are on their arcs, and what decisions they ultimately make in each scene. Paying attention to this repetition of themes clues you into Lucas's approach to these films as cyclical poetry. It can be very enriching to evaluate them as a unit, how these recurring narrative beats inform one another as parts of a respective whole. And one can definitely look even further than I have here to study the subtle differences between the contributions that Lucas's creative collaborators made in each given scene's set design and costume design and cinematography, should one wish. And Jesse just dismisses all of the value of these techniques as boring blocking, sandwiches it in between a couple other similarly shallow, nuance-free stock phrases, wooden acting, and unnecessary use of CGI in a single sentence. And it goes by so quickly being just one sentence in a 6-hour video. Of course, I also just don't have much use for criticism that writes any work of art off as boring in general. It doesn't really tell you anything about what the art itself is doing, or even how it's going to resonate with audiences en masse. The biological processes of our human attention span hasn't really changed much over the course of human history. The predisposition to be bored so easily by films is an individual problem, and it's mostly brought on by an individual's media consumption habits shorting out their synapse connections, limiting their ability to properly evaluate the art itself. I don't hold it against anyone if they don't read the movies in the way I just outlined above. If someone is just watching a movie once to be entertained and certain elements didn't grab their attention or provide the entertainment value that they wanted, that's a matter of personal taste, and that's fine. Again, the issue I have with this is people presenting their video essays as educational dissections of Lucas's films and suggesting that they understand Star Wars better than its creator.
Hey Jesse, I think I went a little too far in some places.
And when one hears this enough times in enough YouTube reviews of Star Wars, they internalize it and are further discouraged from studying the films closely enough to fully interpret on their own everything that I just described above. And the frequency with which such YouTube channels do this indicates to me that many of the most prominent voices on the World Wide Web are unequipped or perhaps simply deliberately reluctant to appreciate any of the cinematic merit that the prequels have to offer, of which I believe there to be much. And I believe these patterns had a very large role in shaping the state of Star Wars discussion, especially during the late 2000s and early 2010s. Lucas always knew that some people were going to get their knickers in a bunch over how he was making the prequels, though. Honestly, that's one of the things that always delights me most about how Lucas talks about them in interviews before each of their releases. He knew exactly how they were going to be received by certain types of critics and certain demographics. The fans' expectations had gotten way too high, and they wanted a film that was going to change their lives and be the second coming. I can't do that, it's just a movie, and I can't say, now I gotta market it to a whole different audience. I tell the story. I knew if I'd made Anakin 15 instead of 9, then it would have been more marketable. If I'd made the Queen 18 instead of 14, then it would have been more marketable. But that isn't the story. It is important that he be young, that he be at an age where leaving his mother is more of a drama than it would have been at 15. So you just have to do what's right for the movie, not what's right for the market.
There is a group of fans of the films that don't like comic sidekicks. They want the films to be tough and like Terminator, and they want to be, real guy movies. And they get very, very upset and very opinionated about anything that has anything to do with being childlike, which the movies are for children, but they don't want to admit that, or a comic sidekick, because they don't want comedy in these movies. and in the first film, they absolutely hated R2 and 3PO. Now Jar Jar is getting accused of the same thing.
How rude! How rude!
Yeah, but come on. I mean, when they go after your writing, your directing, it has to hurt.
Oh, it always hurts.
It has to hurt.
It hurts a great deal. But part of making movies is you get attacked, and sometimes in very personal ways.
Did you not say ever to yourself, well, maybe they had a point with this or with that?
The point is, it's like if you paint your house white, and somebody comes along, well, that should be a greenhouse. Well, fine, but I wanted to paint it white. I don't think there's anything wrong with painting it white. I don't think there's anything wrong with me for painting it white. Maybe it should be a greenhouse. But I didn't want it to be a greenhouse. I wanted it to be a White House. The only reason it's fun is because I don't have to answer to anybody. I don't have anybody telling me what to do. That's what I've earned.
I told people at Lucasfilm that they're going to have to face the reality that I'm making a movie that nobody wants to see, but I want to tell that story. I'm more interested in telling the story than I am in just doing a franchise where you tell the same story over and over again.
How do we blow it up? There's always a way to do that.
So you made the movie for yourself. I make all my movies for myself. People will say when you release it, it belongs to the public. No, it's mine. I'm leasing it to you $10 at a time. It still belongs to me. This principle also goes for how he's changed the movies over time. Lucas wanted to polish the movie so that they would serve the story he wanted to tell, and as he's communicated, he earned the right to do just that. So you can say Han shot first all you want. You can shout it at the top of your lungs that you believe Han shot first. You can make a despecialized version of the film in which Han shoots first. But the fact is, by doing any of that, you're still complaining about and giving credence to the fact that Greedo did in fact shoot first.
McClunky.
You know, it used to be pretty much universally accepted that the most recently completed version of an author's work was always the definitive version of that work, even if an unreasonably vocal minority didn't like a certain alteration made in later versions.
Serious? Are you serious?
For a while, I believed that Lucas might have been better off titling the re-releases of the trilogy as the director's cut or final cut like Blade Runner, instead of the special edition. I thought that if he'd done that, fans would have been more accepting of it as just the new standard version of the films. But the term special edition was only really ever used for the 1997 re-releases as a marketing label to get people excited about seeing a restored, enhanced version of the movie, and it's scarcely been used since then. In pretty much every subsequent home release, it's just Star Wars. Greedo getting a shot off before Han fires back can't be dismissed as an alternate director's cut or one of two equally valid ways to watch the scene. Everyone has to just acknowledge it as part of Lucas's story, and this is what he wanted to achieve for each and every revision. This is also why some changes were done to connect the original films with the prequels. Lucas wanted everyone who watches the movies to have to accept them as one story.
You know, you gotta remember this is one movie, and it's meant to be seen 1 through 6. So I think when you watch the actual movie in order, the story will become very clear.
Fans who don't like what Lucas did with the prequels or his revisions to the OT sometimes suggest that at a certain point, ownership of art passes from the artist himself into some depersonalized, nebulous public. This is something Rick Worley talks a lot about in his video on the special editions.
I think that once you put it out there, you
Because I know
really
what,
are.
think about it. You're putting your stuff out there. Is it yours or is it everyone else's? I think it's shared.
You gotta respect the fans a little bit.
George, you need to take a long fucking walk off a short fucking pier at the moment because your movies are the worst piece of shit I have ever seen.
George Lucas raped our childhood. George Lucas raped our childhood. George Lucas raped our childhood.
He just kind of seems like a retard that wants to see neat things happen with this computer.
He had decayed. And you can see this decay as an artist in his films.
You gotta respect the fans a little bit.
Does he have the right to make all these changes, or do the movies belong to the fans?
When something becomes as popular and as really important to culture as Star Wars does, it's a really fine line. Legally, it's clear. Of course, it belongs to George Lucas, but there's a moral obligation. There's a, I think.
But it's an inherently meaningless sentiment. It has no real-world applicability. Your art belongs to all of us, but especially me because I think it should. Until October 30th, 2012, Lucas held complete legal ownership of Star Wars, but even though he no longer has the legal ownership, the films he made are still always going to remain his art and reflect his vision. They're a piece of him that will remain in the world even when he leaves it. Fans can claim all they want that Star Wars belongs to them, but it's not true. It's just what they want to be true. But they can't make it be true in any meaningful way and don't seem inclined to reflect upon why they can't. It's obvious to any reasonable person that Lucas earned the power to do however he pleased with Star Wars because he had the imagination, the work ethic, and the unmatched talent in the art of filmmaking that brought Star Wars into existence in the first place. But some people just can't accept that liking a work of art and wishing you could own it isn't the same as actually creating that art.
It's not too much to ask. I mean, it really isn't. I think considering the love and the passion and the money that we've given this guy over, 3+ decades, that's the one thing that the fans have asked for repeatedly.
In other words, as Paul F. McDonald, author of the book The Star Wars Hearsays, says on his blog of the same name, this may come as a shock, but when you were watching these movies over and over again as children, you weren't making future investments. You weren't purchasing stock in Lucasfilm. No matter how much money you shelled out on Empire merchandise, it in no way, shape, or form gives you the right to dictate artistic policy 30 years later. You bought a toy back then? Okay, you got a toy. You saved your grass cutting money to go buy a ticket to see A New Hope again? Okay, you got to see A New Hope again. Your grandparents gave you money for a Chewbacca t-shirt? Okay, you got a Chewbacca t-shirt. End of story. Game over. Transaction complete.
I don't understand.
I don't understand.
I just don't understand.
I just don't understand that.
And I don't know why.
I cannot even wrap my mind around it.
So if you're one of those fans who loved the original films and got yourself all amped up to see Phantom Menace, and then after you watched it, you left the theater feeling deflated, like it was the biggest disappointment you'd ever experienced, that it was a personal slight against your childhood, tough. It's not your story. Again, we're all just leasing the story from George Lucas. So the thing that disappoints me about the way people just parrot all the same platitudes about how George had great ideas but he failed in the execution, or he needed more people who weren't afraid to tell him no, or stuff like that, is that they're knowingly denying themselves the opportunity to engage with his art as art. And given what a sincere and unique filmmaker Lucas is, it's kind of perverse to just act like he failed at making his art just because he didn't do it the way you wish he would have. And through a series of very unfortunate circumstances, the final trilogy in the Star Wars saga was made by and for people who think exactly that. People who don't like George Lucas's art and don't care to understand it. People such as the man of the hour, the master storyteller, J.J. Abrams. A grandmaster of 4D chess got his hands on a movie camera, and his name was Jean-Jacques Abrams.
Somehow Palpatine returned.
I do want to make something incredibly clear when I talk about this though, because there's a tendency among some to assess the confluence of the backlash against the prequels and personal attacks on Lucas, place these alongside his decision to sell his company to Disney, pull a few quotes he gave around the same time, and simplify it all down to the idea that toxic fans bullied Lucas into selling Star Wars.
No, that's not it.
Lucas hasn't even used the internet in decades. Reportedly, he doesn't even have email. Look at this man writing his scripts in pencil on notebook paper and yellow legal pads. He doesn't care at all about what people say about him online. For the record, I know that includes everything I say about him online. And fair enough, as we saw earlier, even without the internet, he already had Gen X's number when it came to audience reception. I'm bringing this up because it's important to keep in mind that Lucas wasn't concerned at all with fan backlash when he began the process of selling. He sold his company because he was nearing 70 years old and wanted to end the grind of running a company, but he wanted to make sure it would be in safe hands when he stepped away, and so that he could free up his time and focus on his personal experimental films. Which he's definitely been making. He's definitely been hard at work on those small experimental films of his.
I will be directing movies, but not movies generally that will be shown anywhere.
So when are we going to see that movie?
You're not.
But he had every intent of remaining involved with the franchise for a while after selling. That's why he developed his ideas for the sequel trilogy into story outlines from which his chosen screenwriter, Michael Arndt, would then begin developing into a treatment for Episode 7. Where the fans come in is in who Disney ultimately decided to make and market the film for after the sale. From my observations, it's thankfully at least died down somewhat nowadays, but it's hard to overstate just how widespread and unavoidable the vitriol was for years on the World Wide Web, and the knowledge that it at least existed was likely one of the reasons why Lucas wisely stayed offline. Even so, mainstream comedy shows like South Park and Spaced and How I Met Your Mother would make cheap shots at him and his work, and even other so-called professionals in the film industry like that guy from Spaced would say that his films ruined their childhoods like it was a universal axiom, and this dominated the discourse about him and his work. And so while Lucas himself didn't care at all about tailoring his films to appease these people, their voices were still the first to reach Disney's ear when they acquired Lucasfilm and set to work on making more films. And this is why the heads of Disney, like Alan Horn and Bob the Weatherman, were so resistant toward taking any big creative risks. As Bob says in his book, The Ride of a Lifetime, he was already apprehensive about committing to following the story that Lucas outlined.
Alan Horn and I read George's outlines and decided we needed to buy them, though we made clear in the purchase agreement that we would not be contractually obligated to adhere to the plot lines he'd laid out.
But of course this raises the question, needed to buy them for what? Because you were enthusiastic about making them into films but simply wanted the freedom to adapt them how best you saw fit? Or you reluctantly agreed to buy them because they were part of a package deal with Lucasfilm's other assets? Given that mere paragraphs later, Bob admits how they broke the news to Lucas that they ended up discarding his story, who can say?
Kathy, JJ, Alan, and I had discussed the direction in which the saga should go, and we all agreed that it wasn't what George had outlined. George knew we weren't contractually bound to anything, but he thought that our buying the story treatments was a tacit promise that we'd follow them, and he was disappointed that his story was being discarded.
They looked at the stories and they said, we want to make something for the fans. So I said, all I wanted to do was tell a story of what happened. You know, it started here and it went there, and it's all about generations, and it's about, you know, the issues of fathers and sons, and that it's not about spaceships. So they decided they didn't want to use those stories.
I should have prepared him for the meeting with JJ and Michael and told him about our conversations, that we felt it was better to go in another direction.
Lucas is paying for Star Wars entirely on his own, so he has an almost unprecedented amount of independence and control.
When I make a movie, I pay attention to how much it costs, but at the same time I get to, I get to do the things that I want to do without somebody arbitrarily coming in and saying, no, you can't do that. You don't need that in the movie.
In other words, the creative direction they decided to take the sequel trilogy in was done to win back the goodwill of dudes like Simon Pegg.
You weren't there at the beginning. You don't know how good it was, how important. This is it for you, this jumped-up firework display of a toy advert. People like you make me sick. What's wrong with you? I don't care if you've saved up all your 50p's, okay? Take your pocket money and get out!
What a prick.
For over a decade, the star of the Cornetto trilogy and a major actor in Abrams' Trek was kind of the most famous of the prequel haters.
I hate the prequels.
And weirdly enough, most of his major complaints were really just parroting the Plinkett reviews.
I want you to tell me who the main character of The Phantom Menace was.
There's no main character in it. Everything that was cool about Star Wars is destroyed, abused, and left for dead.
You see, in most movies, the audience needs a character to connect with. Typically, this character is something called a protagonist.
The characters in the original Star Wars are really clear-cut. They're sort of very easy to understand. These ones, there's some guy who's like a politician, and there's a Japanese alien who's bad.
And you couldn't have possibly imagined that even with all the cool Star Wars-y stuff, that Attack of the Clones could actually be worse than The Phantom Menace.
Okay, the worst is Attack of the Clones because we all thought it was better than The Phantom Menace, but it wasn't. It was just as bad. In fact, it was worse. The Phantom Menace was incredibly disappointing. That's the second one up for me. We all know that because we went to see it and we all cried and it destroyed our life.
I claim it is a worthy addition to the canon. It stands up alongside the rest.
What's wrong with you? What's wrong with you?
How does Simon Pegg think the prequels could be improved? Well, in this interview he did with Edgar Wright and Kevin Smith, he lays out his brilliant rewrite of Phantom Menace that boils down to give the old fans what they want and frame the movie as a flashback. I honestly think that The Phantom Menace would have been so much better if he'd given the old fans a little bit of what they wanted, in just topping and tailing the whole new trilogy. The film starts in the Falcon and all the old guys are there with beards and Chewie's a bit gray, and they've got a little place to go. They're flying in hyperspace and one of Han's kids goes, "What happened in the beginning, Uncle Luke?" And he goes, "Well," and then the story unfolds. Just to see those guys again would have been fabulous. Yeah, never mind that Lucas took such great pains to adhere to a documentary style that specifically avoids doing anything that makes it look like what you're seeing is being staged for the camera. It totally would have made perfect sense to undercut all that by adding a framing device of Uncle Luke. Just like how A New Hope starts with, "Yep, that's me. You're probably wondering how I got in this situation. Well, it all started when I met this mop-headed pod racer."
It's these various ideas that could have been in so many scenes to make them better that Lucas never thinks of.
Now, to be fair, it's not that Simon Pegg hates Star Wars. He just prefers it when it's made by people who know more about Star Wars than George Lucas, the guy who created Star Wars. Don't you think that some of the best Star Wars experiences since the first 3 films have been on the ancillary media? Particularly the games, like the Jedi Outcast game on the PC where you get to be a young Jedi. That wasn't made by him, but by Star Wars fans who ultimately answered to him but nonetheless seem to know it better than he does. Kevin Smith follows this by saying, he should just turn it over to a whole bunch of people who are fans and then just sign off on it. As long as you're not going to do obscene things with the characters and do great fucking stories that honor the memory of what is past. Of course, eventually they got their wish, and thank goodness, because once Lucas turned Star Wars over to a bunch of people who are fans, including Pegg himself, never once did they do any obscene things with the characters. Instead, they honored the memories of what had passed. So of course Pegg was over the moon about his friend JJ directing episode 7. I think if anyone can pull Star Wars out of the mire, it's JJ. He'll bring the fun back. Lucas seemed to misread what made the first ones great and concentrate on things that people didn't really care about or willfully ignore the things that people cared about, whereas JJ will embrace them all.
I'm in heaven.
Simon Pegg was a creative consultant for and had a minor role in The Force Awakens as a junk dealer named Unkar Plutt. He and everyone else on the production team talked a big game about eschewing computer animation in favor of going back to the old ways of in-camera special effects like puppets and animatronics. Pegg subjected himself to hours of makeup and prosthetics on a daily basis in commitment to this arbitrary principle. After filming Wrapped, ILM was then tasked with animating his face using computers anyway, once the creative leads realized his acting ability on set was so restricted by said makeup and prosthetics. Abrams and company digitally painted over the limitations of the old-fashioned techniques he and Pegg had been so pleased with themselves for using.
Jar Jar Binks makes the Ewoks look like fucking Shaft!
But did that stop Pegg from taking more shots at the prequels on the press tour for The Force Awakens? Of course not. If anything, having creative input in the series seemed to embolden him even further. I don't really have any respect for anyone who thinks those films are good. They're not. They're a monumental misunderstanding of what the original 3 films are about. It's an exercise in utter infanticide, like George Lucas killing his kid. This man had more say in the creation of the 7th Star Wars film than George Lucas.
Kathy and I have been working on future Star Wars films, and the main reason I brought Kathy on is rather than quit, I wanted to have it move forward, but I needed somebody I trusted who could take that franchise and make it work the way I intended it to.
A few months before we closed the deal, George hired the producer Kathy Kennedy to run Lucasfilm. It was an interesting move on George's part. We were on the verge of buying the company, but he suddenly decided who was going to run it and ultimately produce the upcoming films. It didn't upset us, but it did come as a surprise, just as it surprised Kathy to learn that the company she was agreeing to run was about to be sold. Kathy is a legendary producer, and she has been a great partner, and this was one final way for George to put someone in whom he trusted to be the steward of his legacy.
Now, I know I've made it clear in these videos that I have a great admiration for George Lucas to the point that I consider him one of my heroes. However, this situation is one in which I can and will be critical of him. I understand that his desire was to have a successor who would help him retain influence over Star Wars even as he was no longer directly in charge. I respect how important this was to him, and I wish Kennedy's tenure as his successor reflected a similar respect. However, the way he went about this put Kennedy in a very uncomfortable position. Kennedy had to answer directly directly to the boss of Disney, but she was also expected to carry out Lucas's vision for Star Wars. And as the prior quotes from Bob show, he was not willing to allow Lucas to retain the creative control that he wanted. This was definitely an unenviable position for Kennedy to be in, both personally and professionally, and she shouldn't have had to be put in it. That being said, Kennedy really didn't need to do this.
Jar Jar's definitely not. Ewoks are not in the movie.
Jar Jar Binks makes the Ewoks look like fucking Shaft.
Kennedy has a few of these sound bites actually, in which she low-key throws shade at Lucas regarding the more controversial aspects of his work. The most notable example of this, I think, is when the author of her 2016 profile in Vanity Fair asked her if she would have ever put Princess Leia in a golden bikini. With a chain around her neck, Kennedy asked, "I don't think that would happen." She quickly added that she didn't think George Lucas would have put her in that bikini today. However, Melody Hobson, Lucas's wife, apparently got in touch with this article's author and clarified George is not apologetic about that bikini, and that he thinks that was a very important scene. He would probably do the same thing today. He is not apologetic at all. This section of the article concludes with the author noting that a small statuette of the cast of Return of the Jedi featuring Leia in her bikini sits outside Kennedy's office. She hasn't taken it down. Let's be clear about this, Lucas has had to develop the thickest skin one could have after all the backlash he's received over the years. I find it pretty significant that Kennedy managed to take him off enough that he had Hobson clarify his stance on this. I think the reason why he felt compelled to set the record straight on this is because of Kennedy's suggestion that Lucas would have made his film differently today. As we examined earlier, Lucas isn't interested in having his art be messed with by any extraneous forces, and that almost certainly includes any concerns over how prudes in the current year might react to the sight of a woman in a revealing outfit. This is the only instance I know of where Lucas had someone refute statements made about him on his behalf, but it's far from the only instance of the cast and crew of the sequel suggesting that their Star Wars serves to correct the error of Lucas's Star Wars. Across the board, the central thesis of the press tour for The Force Awakens was that the movie was saving Star Wars from George Lucas. And at the forefront of this pattern was J.J. Abrams himself, of course, who made the discourse around Star Wars exponentially more thoughtful and pleasant by taking every single question anyone asked him as carte blanche to trash the prequels. Oh, he would never do it outright, of course. Perish the thought. He said it himself. I'm certainly not going to prequel bash. I empathize with the many fans who just love the feeling of the original films. In the article where Abrams says this, the interviewer asks Abrams about a fan website called DearJJAbrams.com. It's not active anymore, thankfully, but back in 2013, if you visited it, your eyes would be graced with this embarrassing video where Mike Stoklas's first cousin twice removed gives Abrams 4 rules to how to make Star Wars great again.
Star Wars doesn't happen in the city. It doesn't happen in Parliament or in the library. It happens out here, away from civilization, amidst smugglers and bounty hunters. Star Wars is a Western, and it's set in the frontier. Star Wars beauty isn't clean. It isn't new. It's dirty, gritty, a secondhand world. The beauty of the frontier. We don't always need an explanation. The greatest power of the Force is the sense of magic that comes from the unknown. Walk into the wrong bar, lose your arm. Don't pay your debts, end up in carbonite. The frontier is a dangerous place. It's never cute or silly. It's not child-proofed. It's freaking Star Wars. And Han always shoots first.
Not only did Abrams watch this video, not only did he love it, not only did he completely agree with it, but he made a point of disclosing that he had personal correspondence with the guy who made it. Yes, folks, along with Simon Pegg, Abrams also valued this guy's opinion on Star Wars more than he valued George Lucas's, because the universe is just full of blessings.
Star Wars doesn't happen in the city. It happens out here, away from civilization.
A few spaceports like this one are havens for those that don't wish to be found.
Amidst smugglers and bounty hunters.
I've been tracking a bounty hunter named Django Fett.
Walk into the wrong bar, lose your arm. The frontier is a dangerous place. It's never cute. Or silly.
I've isolated the reverse power flux coupling.
R2. It's not child-proofed. It's freaking Star Wars! And Han always shoots first.
McClunky.
Abrams had plenty of other promises to share for how he was going to make Star Wars great again. He said that he would have the lightsaber duels be less flashy and stylish like the ones in the prequels. Yeah, some people might not remember this, but the dumbest recurring point people made during the era I was talking about earlier was that the duels in the prequels were over-choreographed, too flashy, too over-the-top. YouTube film critics spilled a lot of digital ink to try to convince you to not like some of the coolest fight sequences ever created.
Their flawless choreography lacks all humanity and emotion.
They're executing all of their moves perfectly as they were told to through their choreography, and it goes on and it goes on and on and on. And Obi-Wan should have totally used his speed run to go through the red blaster door area, but of course he didn't, because screenplay by George Lucas.
When you look at Star Wars and Empire, they are very different lightsaber battles, but for me they felt more powerful because they were not quite as slick. I was hoping to go for something more primitive, aggressive, and rougher. I'll give Abrams this, the lightsaber duels in The Force Awakens and Rise of the Skywalkers as well are the only duels anywhere near as unimpressive and clunky as the one in A New Hope. The best part of going back to these old articles is seeing their respective authors sandwich Abrams' answers in between their own snarky prequel bashing. You know what? J.J. Abrams actually seems to get what Star Wars fans want. The film will be going less down the multi-lightsaber wielding General Grievous or backflipping Darth Maul route, instead trying to capture that wonderful atmosphere that comes with two lightsabers slowly wavering in the dark. More of a ballet than a martial arts fest. Oh good, I'm so glad that we're going back to the old ways of the original trilogy, where there were never any backflips. And that we're finally returning to that wonderful atmosphere of two lightsabers wavering in the dark. Like a ballet, which was sorely missing in the prequels. At one point, Abrams wanted his entry into the grand history of the Star Wars films to show Jar Jar's carcass. I have a thought about putting Jar Jar Binks' bones in the desert there. I'm serious, only 3 people will notice, but they'll love it. Quite possibly the weirdest example of all this is this bit from Rolling Stone's feature on the movie in which Abrams specifically instructed Roger Guyette to remove a flag that referenced the pod race. But JJ, what's the problem? By your own estimation, only 3 people would even notice. Now that's not to say that Abrams hated everything about the prequels. He liked the scenes that took place on a set from the original trilogy. I was surprised by how good it felt to be home. Given all the scope and scale of everything that had come before, there was something incredibly satisfying and warm and fuzzy about being back in those white hallways that sort of rekindled the feeling you had when you saw the Star Wars universe for the first time.
Revenge of the Sith is the best of a bad bunch because there are at least a few nods. You know, you see the Bridge of the Tantavian there, and there was some connection to the first three films which saved it for me, even though it was another...
And then all of a sudden, wow, is that a Star Wars set? Are we finally on a Star Wars set? Thank you!
It gets to a point where Abrams doesn't even seem to like the actual story the original trilogy was telling. One time he was asked to say if there were any characters whose story he'd like to know more about, and this is what he said. It's funny how in a weird way, sometimes by demystifying a character, it takes away from some of the fun that you felt about that character. It takes the mystery out of it.
We've got the droids, they meet the mysterious woman. Who's that? We don't know. Mystery box.
For me, the character of Darth Vader was always so compelling because you were putting together all these things in your head and making all these assumptions that to get to know Anakin as much as we ultimately did changed the way you consider Darth Vader. It's crazy that my kids relate to Anakin, which to me is criminal because I grew up believing Vader was a bad guy. I related to Luke and Leia and Han Solo. You just don't relate to Vader. I still think it's wrong to be on Anakin's side. This is a terrible, myopic viewpoint that fundamentally misunderstands the entire point of Star Wars, and I'm gonna tell you why. The entire purpose of starting Star Wars with Anakin as an innocent child is to show that at the beginning of his story, he was a genuinely good kid. He's at the very bottom of the economic and social hierarchy. He lives at the very edge of civilization, as far from the bright center of the galaxy as one could get. And yet, when the opportunity is presented to him, he does all he can to help out a group of strangers simply because it's the right thing to do.
He gives without any thought of reward.
Well, he knows nothing of greed.
Anakin is first presented as a remarkably altruistic boy in The Phantom Menace so that the target audience can understand with perfect clarity that it's his emotional attachment to his mother that informs all of the evil acts he will go on to commit. It's not that he's an unrealistically good or flawless person at first, it's that in spite of all his goodness, he has the fatal flaw of being unable or unwilling to let go of his attachments.
I won't lose you the way I lost my mother.
The point of this is that having such intense, passionate love for people to the point that you would do anything to avoid feeling the pain of living without them is natural. It's human. But achieving lasting happiness necessitates having the discipline to accept that when people are no longer in your life or when they die, you must let them go. Anakin refuses to accept this, and that's why he turns to the dark side. Is it wrong to be on Anakin's side when he does this? Of course it is, because the movie is telling you that indulging in such greed is why Anakin became the most evil person in the galaxy. Abrams' problem is that he cannot differentiate between understanding why Anakin feels the way he does about his mother and Padme from being on his side as he commits atrocities in the name of love for them. I can only speculate as to why he has such trouble with this. And I hate to break it to you, Abrams, but Lucas told the story of Anakin's fall in this way so that you'd feel uneasy about seeing the same flaws in Luke.
Obviously, Anakin takes a different road than his son takes. So that at some of these turning points, they go the other way. But it's been set up for you to almost expect that they will go, that Luke will follow in his father's footsteps, because in a lot of these episodes, they do follow each other, which leads to a subtle influence, which gives the audience a little expectation. Anakin's position here when he leaves his mother is not that much different from when Obi-Wan asked him to come along with him on his adventure. And he decides he can't do it because he has all these obligations and he doesn't want to leave his home. And even though he's very anxious to leave, from the first part of the movie, it's the same kind of conflict. In this one, he takes the road. In the one with Luke, he decides not to take the road, but the inevitability of events force him to take the road. It's sort of like fate. And it would be the same thing here. But in this case, he didn't wait for fate to push him into this. He took the road.
Just like Anakin, Luke also struggles with his attachments to the people he loves, to the point that they jeopardize his journey of becoming a Jedi. His attachment to his sister leads him to the brink of turning to the dark side himself. He realizes after this that all the good and all the bad in him came from his father. So if you relate to Luke Skywalker, if you're on his side, the temptation of the dark side might be stronger than you think. The point of Star Wars is not to praise or scold you for relating to any of the Skywalkers. The point is that we are the Skywalkers.
You made all this shit up.
Star Wars is not a story about satiating your preconceptions about life. It's a story that presents clearly and unambiguously what good and evil look like, where they come from, and then shows how easy it is for good people to become evil. I think some people don't understand this because some people are reluctant to look inward and accept that they might have something in common with Anakin.
The Phantom Menace was 18 months ago, Tim. I know, Bilbo. Okay, it still hurts. It's not fair.
They don't like the idea that the prequel trilogy might have something valuable to say about how we should live.
I don't want things to change.
But you can't stop the change.
It didn't need to be redefined. It just needed to be brought back.
They don't want to challenge the way they felt when they first sat in a theater and watched Star Wars for the first time when they were 10.
The prequel trilogy was less my thing, partly because, I don't want to know about midichlorians. I don't want to know that the Force comes from something that's in your blood. I'm not saying that's not what it is, and if that's what it is for George, then that's what it is. But it just wasn't interesting to me.
But Abrams does have a point. You don't relate to Vader. You can't relate to him because of all the evil things he did. And he did do a lot of evil things. He slaughtered a bunch of Jedi and burned their temple. He murdered his own father figure. He oversaw the construction of a superweapon that destroyed an entire planet. And he tried to get the hero to turn to the dark side.
We can end this destructive conflict and bring order to the galaxy.
So obviously, what Abrams is saying is that if someone betrays the Jedi and burns their temple,
He had vanished with a handful of my students and slaughtered the rest.
If he murders his father, if he builds a superweapon that destroys an entire planet, or heaven forbid, 5 planets, and if he tries to get the hero to turn to the dark side,
we can rule together and bring a new order to the galaxy.
Then you shouldn't root for him or sympathize with him in any way. And it would be wrong-headed, heretical even, to humanize them and give them a redemption arc.
You ignite the red matter.
I want Spock dead now! Blow that piece of junk out of the sky!
Does Abrams also hate the special editions? Do you even have to ask that at this point?
Would you, as a fan, like to see the theatrical versions made available commercially?
Yes, and I have asked about this. This is because who wouldn't want to see that? But I've been told that for reasons that I don't quite understand, that's not necessarily possible.
Interesting.
Which is, too bad, because that was the thing that I loved. In fact, it's funny, when we were working on Force Awakens, we were talking about this one scene with Vader and the Emperor, and we were having this disagreement about what was said in a way that was, like, we both felt crazy. And we realized we were talking about 2 different versions, because there's like the sort of despecialized version which you can see online. Someone got me a version, but it's apparently not at the quality level that one needs to release it on a 4K version. And then there was the official version. So there was the original theatrical version, and then the version that people see now.
I love this one because in the middle of Abrams' usual cutting himself off and talking over himself, he reveals that he was so used to watching Harmy's Frankenstein fan edit of Empire Strikes Back that it affected how he understood the story of Star Wars. I know the exact scene he's talking about. It's the scene with Vader and the Emperor, which Lucas changed for the re-releases by adding Ian McDiarmid and giving the characters some new dialogue to clarify what they know about Luke Skywalker's relation to Anakin.
We have a new enemy, Luke Skywalker.
Yes, my master.
He could destroy us.
We have a new enemy. The young rebel who destroyed the Death Star. I have no doubt this boy is the offspring of Anakin Skywalker.
How is that possible?
Search your feelings, Lord Vader. know it to be true. He could destroy us.
Abrams was insistent that the dialogue that specifically gave greater clarity to what Vader knew about Luke wasn't part of the movie. I think this tells us a lot about who The Force Awakens was primarily made for. It was made by and for the kind of person who would torrent a fan edit of Star Wars that superficially resembles the way the movies looked like when they were 12, and are insistent on pretending it's the real version. And that's why the entire new cast felt it important to tell you on multiple occasions that they think Han shot first.
Who shot first? Han or Greedo?
What,
sorry?
Han Solo shot first.
Definitely, without doubt.
For me, it did.
Okay.
Greedo never shot first! The only gun that's fired belongs to Cock-a-Doodle Han!
Han shot first.
Thank you. I
what
really,
kind of question is that?
It's really out. I love George for what he did, but he's fucking wrong about the Greedo shooting first.
Greedo did not shoot first, George.
We're on the exact same page. Who shot first, Han or Greedo?
Han.
Thank you. I appreciate that answer. Who shot first, Han or Greedo?
Han.
Han shot first.
Without a doubt.
Without a doubt. There's no debate.
Han.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Just because that's his
Because
in his
Han is
character.
badass.
Up with those
Han
movies.
Solo fired first!
Yeah, that.
Han always shoots first.
He's almost like a Holocaust denier, but he's a Star Wars denier. It's like, this never existed. Don't worry about that.
Did you shoot Greedo first, or did Greedo shoot you first?
I don't care.
The Force Awakens isn't a sequel to George Lucas's Star Wars. It's a sequel to Project 4K77.
In what order should the first 6 films be seen?
4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3.
As was, I guess, intended in a way, right?
It must have been, yeah.
I'd say 4, 5, 2, 3, 6, then check out 1 at some point.
I heard this way of watching the movies called the machete order, where you watch episodes 4 and 5, then skip episode 1, watch 2 and 3 as a flashback, and then finish with 6.
Okay, so you'd lose most of Jar Jar.
Jar Jar, unfairly hated or justifiably so?
Maybe justifiable. I would say a poor character.
Kids like Jar Jar! Yeah, but Jar Jar Binks makes the Ewoks look like fucking sharks.
I'm not gonna ask you who shot first. I know you get the question all the time. I'm not gonna go down that route. You get it a million times. But I do have a question about that, because obviously in the 77 version, you do shoot first. We've seen that a million times, and Lucas did change it to Greedo.
I don't care. I think it's interesting that people are interested in that and discuss it amongst themselves. It doesn't make any difference to me. If George, if George cut it that way, then that's the way it should be.
You were the chosen one!
What if someone else beside you came to you and said, I want to make episode 7? Could you see that happening?
No.
No, absolutely, positively, you're really closing the door without any
Right.
wiggle room whatsoever.
Right. There is no episode 7.
And then the world saw Episode 7, The Force Awakens, and it was one of the most mean-spirited, regressive films in the history of the medium itself. The very first line of the film was a fourth wall-breaking platitude of correcting the perceived transgressions of George Lucas.
This will begin to make things right.
It was a clear, firm statement that Star Wars was not going to progress creatively or narratively, that the galaxy was to remain trapped in endless war even as the setup and framework no longer made a lick of sense.
When Star Wars came out, everybody said, oh, it's a silly movie, it's just a bunch of space battles and stuff. It's not real. There's nothing behind it. And I said, well, there is stuff behind it. It's not just a space battle. There's more to it than that. It's much, much more complicated than that. But nobody would listen. So they just said, oh, well, it's simple, and we like the spaceships, we like the stuff. So they said, fine. So the spaceships and that part of the science fantasy, whatever, got terribly abused. And of course, everybody went out and made spaceship movies, and they were all horrible. And you say, well, there's more to it than that. You can't just go out and do spaceships. My advice to anyone making a Star Wars movie is there's more to it than just spaceships. Whenever there's a new tool, everybody goes crazy, and they forget the fact that there's actually a story, and that's the point. You're telling a story using tools. You're not using tools to tell a story.
What are you doing?
Lightspeed skipping.
The studios and everything said, well, wow, we can make a lot of money. This is a license to kill. And they did it. They just simply, and of course, the only way you could really do that is not take chances. Only do something that's proven.
JJ and I had dinner soon after he decided to take on the project. And it was important to me to sit down and acknowledge what we both knew, that the stakes on this project were higher than anything either of us had ever done before. I joked at some point during dinner that this was a $4 billion movie.
You said this is a $4 billion movie.
That's right, exactly. And I said, this is a $4 billion movie. Because of the size of the acquisition and what this first film represented in terms of importance and value creation, that you can expect that it's not going to be treated like any old film by Disney.
I didn't care whether it was a hit or not a hit. I wanted to make this movie as a movie. And that's the thing that they won't do. And that they can't do it. It's not in their constitution to do that.
I make decisions based on a few things. First of all, what's important to the company.
You know, Bob, a company
is like an enormous clock.
Yes, precisely.
But I think we owed it to the fans of Star Wars.
You gotta respect the fans a little bit.
We owed it to the shareholders of the Walt Disney Company.
We're supposed to help our people, starting with our stockholders, Bob. Who's helping them out, huh?
You know, I have a fiduciary duty to come up with a thing. I got it 10% a year, my stockholders. That's why I would never go public. And that's why I said, I'm not going to be beholden to anybody. It is my life. I mean, everything I write is my life. I'm not writing some sort of hypothetical thesis on something. I'm writing a story that I have to get extremely emotional involved in because it's going to take 2 or 3 years of my life to do it. So I can't just sort of say, oh, this will be fun and knock it off in a week. This is like a marriage. This goes on. You have to be in love with this thing for at least 4 or 5 years and probably for the rest of your life.
I had nothing to do with that. See, this is the beauty of having not really been involved with the series past the pilot, is I was not responsible for who was directing that show. I knew if Seven worked as well as I was hoping it would, then that's a wonderful place to have done, you know, my part in the Star Wars world and stepped back. And if it didn't go as well as I was hoping it would, no one would want me to do the next one.
So this company isn't really run by one person. It's run by a collection of people whose input and contribution are considerable.
Kathy screened The Force Awakens for George. He didn't hide his disappointment. There's nothing new, he said. In each of the films in the original trilogy, it was important to him to present new worlds, new stories, new characters, and new technologies. In this one, he said, there weren't enough visual or technical leaps forward. He wasn't wrong, but he also wasn't appreciating the pressure we were under to give ardent fans a film that felt quintessentially Star Wars. We'd intentionally created a world that was visually and tonally connected to the earlier films, to not stray too far from what people loved and expected. And George was criticizing us for the very thing we were trying to do.
I have to say that I felt that George's group of 6 films had more innovative visual imagination. And this film was more of a retrenchment to things you had seen before and characters you had seen before. And it took a few baby steps forward with new characters.
We've got to remember, Star Wars came from nowhere. American Graffiti came from nowhere. There was nothing like it. Now, if you do anything that's not a sequel, or not a TV series, or it doesn't look like one, they won't do it. They say, we want something that we know.
So that's the downside of Star Wars.
That's the downside of Star Wars. And it really shows an enormous lack of imagination and fear of creativity on the part of an industry.
Oh, George.
Oh, George. This is great.
Upon coming down from the initial emotional high that the film instilled, and after thanking Abrams for saving Star Wars, many then paused and heard the words that had just come out of their mouths, looked back at the film, and realized that something about it felt very familiar. and felt off. And as Abrams began to defend his uncreative decisions and why he made the film this way, he began to let slip his true goals of redefining the brand so that it would superficially resemble how the first movie looked, but now under the lens of the arrogant Gen Xer who felt it was appropriate to try to reclaim a story from its author. It had been so long since the last one. Obviously the prequels had existed in between, and we wanted to sort of reclaim the story. So we very consciously, and I know it is derided for this, we very consciously tried to borrow familiar beats so the rest of the movie could hang on something that we knew was Star Wars.
To give ardent fans a film that felt quintessentially Star Wars.
I trust you understand which Star Wars films they're implying are not quintessentially Star Wars. Something that vexes me about Bob's defensiveness over playing it so safe with Episode 7
There is no Episode 7.
is that throughout every other chapter in Bob's book, he talks at great length about the value of risk-taking. Particularly in his chapter on Disney's acquisition of Pixar, he acknowledges that Pixar's constantly taking big creative risks was one of the things that helped them eclipse Disney in the late 90s and early 2000s. The imagination they fostered was something Bob says he knew was missing in his own company's animation department.
People sometimes shy away from taking big swings because they assess the odds and build a case against trying something before they even take the first step. One of the things I've always instinctively felt, and something that was greatly reinforced working for people like Rune and Michael, is that long shots aren't usually as long as they seem. Nothing is a sure thing, but you need at the very least to be willing to take big risks. You can't have big wins without them.
I don't say any of this because I genuinely expect Bob the Weatherman to be some maverick wild card. I know realistically that as the boss of Disney, his job is to make the company as much money as possible. All other concerns are secondary to that. But the way he talks about these experiences implies otherwise. He says that when he became the boss of Disney, he wanted their films to take visual and technological leaps forward. And yet when it comes to Star Wars, he completely defends their decision to not do that. With Star Wars, and only with Star Wars, it's all about thinking inside the box, not straying too far from what people expected, given to the pressure of giving ardent fans what they want. The thing that made the Disney-Pixar relationship work is that Disney let Pixar be Pixar. None of Pixar's films were ever about giving audiences what they already wanted. Audiences realize upon seeing a Pixar film that it's what they hadn't realized they needed. In contrast, The Force Awakens was, by Bob's admission, tailored to the expectations of fans. But fan service is not respect for the film's audience, it's flattery. In any case, for all the talk about going back to the original film's roots with shooting on 35mm film with real sets and practical effects and blah 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 blah, Force Awakens doesn't feel quintessentially Star Wars at all. Stylistically, it could not be further from how Lucas made his films. Abrams obviously just thinks that kineticism means that the camera goes swoop-de-doop, and he clearly loves Spielberg's wonders and complex camera movements, but he doesn't have the grace to make them feel effective like the old masters do. The camera is constantly jerking you around the room or pushing in on actors' faces or focusing back and forth. Basically any moment where Lucas would be cutting between shots and having the cuts drive the rhythm of the scene, Abrams instead drives the rhythm with ostentatious moves to give the spurious illusion that the actual story he's telling is deserving of our time and attention.
Mr. Spock, I'm aware that I have no right to ask this of you, but please, he cannot know that
I'm right.
Ray. Help me with this! Quick!
Whoa! What's going on?
Lucas's neutral documentary style always made the fantastic feel natural. One of the reasons why his Star Wars films always feel so immersive is that for all the wonderful planets and interesting aliens and creatures that he would always try to fill up the frame with, he would always take care to try to avoid doing anything that would remind you that what you're watching isn't a real event. It would never feel like any of the action is actually being staged for the camera. Like, go back and watch American Graffiti in THX 1138 and you'll see that before ILM, before he had computer graphics at his disposal, he made the streets of San Francisco and the North Bay feel so authentically like early 60s Modesto, or a nightmarish futuristic dystopia, depending just on what story he wanted to tell. Abrams throws in all this excessive panache to hold the viewer's attention because he doesn't have the confidence in the actual content of his script to carry the film. I used this clip of Chris Pine in an interview talking about how Abrams flat out told him that the actual exposition he was delivering on a scene in their first Star Trek film didn't even matter.
And I asked JJ, I took JJ's side and I said, I'd love to do it one more time because I don't know what I'm saying, and if you could tell me what I'm saying, it would be great help. And he said, it doesn't matter. you just run on, you say it as fast and as earnestly and urgently as possible, and no one's gonna care, because all the audience is gonna think is, something's happening, something's happening.
And so it doesn't matter if you're using the same cameras and the same films and using real sets and blah, 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 because yeah, all of this fundamentally changes how the world of Star Wars feels. Is there anything of substance actually happening here? It doesn't matter. You just saturate the frame with red and blue light, run in with the camera, and then zip it around as fast and as urgently as possible, and all the audience will think is, something's happening. And it only got worse as the films went on. Much has been said about The Last Jedi's metatextual deconstruction of Star Wars as a franchise, but I haven't seen much talk about the inherent pointlessness of such an endeavor. Lucas created Star Wars in part as a response to the genre deconstructionism he was seeing in cinema in the 1970s. He saw that in the wake of events like the Watergate scandal and the Vietnam War, audiences were being inundated with films like Dirty Harry, All the President's Men, The Long Goodbye, Chinatown, and even his friends were part of that trend, with Francis Coppola's The Godfather and Martin Scorsese's Mean Streets and Taxi Driver. And Lucas himself was also part of that trend with his own bleak dystopian tale about the ravaging effects of austerity and control on the human spirit. All that movie did was to make people more pessimistic, more depressed, and less willing to get involved in trying to make the world better. So I decided that this time I would make a more optimistic film that makes people feel positive about their fellow human beings. It's hard to be optimistic when everything tells you to be pessimistic and cynical. Nobody except Disney makes movies for young people anymore. I want to open up the whole realm of space for them. I want Star Wars to make them think of the things that could happen.
The patron creates the propaganda, and what I wanted to do was go back to some of the older propaganda, which was consistent through all of the societies, which is mythology, but to say, what did they all believe? Because they were all, this propaganda was created independently. Yeah. And what are the things that they all actually believed? We're talking about relationships with your father, relationships with your society, your history, relationships with the gods. All of this stuff it's old, but they're psychological motifs that were created through storytelling, primarily oral storytelling, that explained what they believed in and who they believed in. Since the end of the Cold War, and I guess the end of the Vietnam War even more, and in the end of World War II even more than that, we have come to sort of not focus on that kind of thing. And heroes have been taken in a little bit different light. But the human spirit and what it takes to be a hero and what it means to be a hero and what it means to care about somebody hasn't really changed. It's just that we have gotten kind of complacent and not paying attention to the real issues. Mm-hmm. Something like this puts everything back in focus and says, look, you know, people's sex lives are not that important in the real world. What's really important are, you know, taking care of other people and compassion and helping people and sticking together and trying to make this a good world.
I think that's why I'm so excited to be in a film like this, because if I could pick any subject, this would be it. And I think that Star Wars is really more than science fiction. It's a wonderful romantic fantasy story like Wizard of Oz or any of those. So to me, it's more than science fiction.
I'm Luke Skywalker. I'm here to rescue you.
You're who?
I'm here to rescue you. I've got your R2 unit. I'm here with Ben Kenobi.
Ben Kenobi? Where is he?
Come on.
It's the stuff that fairy tales are made of. We have a fairy princess. We have an innocent farm boy who yearns for adventure. Alec Guinness is a wise old wizard who teaches me a mystical force, somewhat like Merlin would teach a young King Arthur. Harrison Ford plays Han Solo, a cynical space pirate that we hire to transport us through the galaxy. Basically, I'm a farm boy. I inherit.
Farm boy makes good.
Oh, I can't keep the vision out of my head. They're my friends. I gotta help them.
You must not go.
But Han and Leia will die if I don't.
That's the amazing thing about this, is that you become a part of the world's family. And I'm so moved by stories of people that were inspired, people that really are facing like health issues and adversities, that find determination and spiritual redemption. I'm always stunned at how it affected people and continues to affect them.
There is good in him. I felt it. He won't turn me over to the Emperor. I can save him. I can turn him back to the good side. I have to try.
They relate stories of how it got them through their mother's illness, or they met their wife online, or it's become such a fabric of their lives. It's truly moving. I don't see it on a day-to-day basis, but when I go out in public or to these celebrations and so forth, it's just astonishing how passionate they really are, and I don't take it for granted.
I'll not leave you here. I've got to save you.
You already have.
I think too many kids feel life is a downer. I talk to a lot of them, and they have no heroes, no Buck Rogers, nobody that they can look at and say, that's what I want to be when I grow up. They need somebody bigger than life that they can look up to, somebody who isn't afraid to go out and tackle problems. They need, well, a romantic vision, a sense of unlimited possibilities. Lucas looked at the state that the world, and especially America, was in and saw a culture-wide crisis of faith. Faith in our own capacity to be good people who upheld the axioms that had been passed down through generations in fairy tales. He saw in film the potential to rekindle such hope in young people who still had a lot to learn about the world, and that they could use a good classic swashbuckling adventure that would at the same time give them a sense of what they should pay attention to as they started growing up. And so the irony, of course, is that Lucas name drops Disney as the only other mainstream group of filmmakers that were doing that were making hopeful, optimistic films that helped children feel good about the world. But once Disney got their hands on Star Wars itself, the films released under their stewardship dragged the series back down into the exact same cynical headspace Lucas rejected, with stories about how the heroes we'd loved would become broken shells who could only ever let us down.
Billions of lives lost because of me, Jim. Because I failed.
Luke felt responsible. He just walked away from everything.
Leia blamed Snoke, but it was me. I failed.
Defenders of The Last Jedi celebrated for its amazing complex themes like learning from failure and moving on from the past. Riveting stuff indeed. No one had ever talked about failure in Star Wars before.
Failed. I
have failed you, Anakin. I have failed you.
The cave. Remember your failure at the cave.
I thought that I could instruct him just as well as Yoda. I was wrong.
Fans celebrate that it humbled Luke by showing that he still had some serious flaws to overcome, that he wasn't just some legendary all-powerful warrior, and that fans were being unreasonable by expecting him to be so. That's what this borderline fourth wall-breaking, deliberately disingenuous rhetorical question is really about.
Did you hear a word I just said?
You think what? I'm gonna walk out with a laser sword and face down the whole First Order? What did you think was going to happen here?
Did anyone actually have these expectations before The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi embedded them into the meta-narrative of the film? Obviously, people were coming up with fan theories about why Luke was on this island in the first place, just as Abrams wanted them to. But did anyone actually have such unrealistic expectations for what Luke was going to do in the films before Abrams had everyone speak about him like a messiah and then end with the teaser of Rey handing his sword back to him?
Luke Skywalker. I thought he was a myth.
Ever since Luke disappeared, people have been looking for him.
In any case, Luke's arc in The Last Jedi doesn't humanize him or give him any extraordinary new depth. All the talk about Luke Skywalker as a legend is only about Luke's relationship to us, the audience. It has nothing to do with his actual character. His arc is that he fears that he's unable to live up to the title of Luke Skywalker from Star Wars because Luke Skywalker from Star Wars is so iconic to audiences around the world today. But Star Wars doesn't happen now, it happened a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. That's the first thing every film tells you. The Last Jedi has been memed to death for its infamous subversion of expectations. Both those who love the film and those who hate it identify the exact same scenes in which the audience's expectations are supposedly being subverted and come to polar opposite conclusions about what the film is saying. Forgive me for playing the enlightened centrist here, but the true path to understanding all that the film is saying is recognizing that the film doesn't subvert expectations at all, except in one important way. The audience expects Luke to come back and save the rebellion. At the end of the movie, Luke comes back and seems to save the rebellion. The audience expects that Rey will become a Jedi. By the end of the movie, Rey harbors the superficial characteristics of a Jedi. The audience expects that the Skywalker who fell to the dark side will kill his Sith master and save the hero. Kyle does exactly that. The only way that the audience's expectations are subverted is that Rian Johnson spends 2 of the movie's 2.5 hours having the character stare right past the camera lens and scold the other characters and the audience itself, so that they'll question why anything in Star Wars matters at all anyway. Then, at the last possible minute, Johnson has Luke stare right into the camera lens and reaffirm that it's still good to like the rebellion and the Jedi, but we should move on from the past and just let the past die. But maybe we should still learn from the past and keep some of the past alive. But let it all die. But the old masters still have something left to teach us, even if they wasted their lives being total failures who have nothing left to teach us. Just let them die.
Go away! Go away. I can't teach you. I came to this island to die. This is not going to go the way you think.
Gee, I wonder why Mark Hamill didn't like how Luke was written in this movie.
I almost had to think of Luke as another character. Maybe he's Jake Skywalker. He's not my Luke Skywalker.
This awful combination of the betrayal of Lucas's vision, cynical metathesis, and narrative incoherence leads us naturally to Jake's climactic final act. The only reason any viewer would think that projecting an airbrushed, hair-dyed image of himself to taunt his nephew for a few minutes is the best that Luke Skywalker could have done is because his sneering at Rey about how she supposedly expected him to walk out with a laser sword and face down the whole First Order is fresh in their minds, as though that's what Rey or any reasonable person in the audience would ever ask him to do. No one did. People wanted Luke to have retained the wisdom he learned from his arc in the original trilogy and use it to rebuild the Jedi Order. You know, as Lucas envisioned. Somehow people have gotten it into their heads that the Jedi were never supposed to use violence, and that what Jake does at the end of The Last Jedi is the greatest representation of what a Jedi should be because it's the ultimate form of non-violence. Lucas never believed that. What Lucas was always communicating is that the Jedi will do their best to resolve conflicts through non-violent means, but when push comes to shove, they must use violence in self-defense. Are you just going to sit there and let them kill you, or your loved ones, or destroy the world that you know, or are you going to try to fix it? At some point, you do have to stand up for what you believe in. If a Cobra is going to strike you, I think you have every right to put a stick up there and hit him over the head, because it's either him or you.
A Jedi uses the Force for knowledge and defense, never for attack.
What Lucas is saying through Yoda here is that the Jedi don't approach conflicts with violent intentions. You shouldn't fight with anger or hatred in your heart.
Simba, being brave doesn't mean you go looking for trouble.
But was Obi-Wan not acting like how a Jedi should when he defeated Maul? Was it not heroic for Obi-Wan to defeat Anakin when Anakin refused to surrender, even after Obi-Wan attained the greatest of all tactical advantages?
I have the high ground!
The closest comparison for this scene in Last Jedi is Obi-Wan facing Vader in A New Hope to keep him distracted so Luke can escape, but one, even within A New Hope alone, even if you still watch the films in release order, thereby making that film your introduction to the character, Obi-Wan is still a hero and a good teacher, and doesn't just sulk around and scold both Luke and the audience for expecting him to actually have any value to the narrative of the film, and two, he's actually present for his fight, thereby actually putting his life on the line to do the right thing, and Vader making the conscious choice to kill Obi-Wan adds to Luke's motivation to become a Jedi and defeat him. If Jake could have been physically present to face Kyle and his army, obviously that would be the right thing to do. He has every reason to be here. The image of him standing taller than the army is prima facie heroic, but people still act like he's choosing to not actually show up and that that's the real heroism. There's nothing heroic about the fact that Jake didn't spill a drop of blood here. The outcome of this scene is that he preserves the lives of the rebels so that they can go on to perform further violence against the enemy, to spill more blood, to take more lives, which is necessary to win a war. Obviously, no one can hold off an entire army to protect the people they love without engaging in violence. The only reason Jake is able to without being killed is because Rian Johnson makes it possible through the invention of a contrived force power that also immediately kills him anyway. Jake has the power to fight Kyle, he has the responsibility to fight Kyle, but he doesn't. He uses the Force not for knowledge, not for defense, and not even to attack, but instead to humiliate his nephew. He doesn't find a peaceful, non-violent solution to defeat the First Order. He just wastes everyone's time and then leaves the fight itself for someone else to finish for him in the next movie. And then he dies. And some fans actually believe Lucas loved this movie, Because a spokesperson for Lucas said that after a screening of the movie with Rian Johnson, Lucas gave the platitude he uses when he wants to be nice about films he doesn't like, that it was beautifully made.
There's a lot of movies that are badly made that I love. There's a lot of movies that are just beautifully made, but I don't like them. Beautifully made, but I don't like them. I don't like that.
Looking back with the perspective of several years and a few more Star Wars films, I believe J.J. achieved the near impossible, creating a perfect bridge between what had been and what was to come.
I designed this video to be an anthropological documentary-style essay that examined all the various cynical sentiments that permeated the conception and cultural goals of the sequel trilogy. Looking at the threads that run through all of them should help make it clear why I so firmly believe that you can't make a good Star Wars story if you don't have respect for George Lucas. People have talked about all the missteps that came from not having a clear plan or having conflicting visions from Abrams versus Johnson, and while all that has been thoroughly covered, I think the truth of why the sequels turned out the way they did is much more simple than that. It was the culminating thesis of several different entities' common desire to save Star Wars from its auteur. They ousted George Lucas from the production, rewrote his mythology, and reclaimed his story. But to the delight of myself and many others, the fallout from the sequel era and the revelations about how Lucas was treated prompted at least some reflection on the part of some of the voices we've talked about earlier. I touched on some of the conflict between Kathy Kennedy and Lucas, but her remarks about his work and her handling of the sequel trilogy did have a degrading effect on their friendship. In Howard Kazanjian, A Producer's Life, Jada Lee Rensler suggests that even by 2018 at Mark Hamill's Walk of Fame ceremony, they still weren't on speaking terms, and when they all went out to lunch, Hamill and his wife basically trapped Lucas and Kennedy into talking with each other. Howard and Carol Kazanjian walked with Harrison Ford, then sat with Lucas and Marilu Hamill. Kathleen Kennedy took a seat with them. Lucas had stated several times publicly that Kennedy and execs at Disney had pushed him out and discarded his ideas for the Star Wars sequels, but he and Kennedy talked for some time. He was trapped, Kazanjian says. He sat down on a long bench and Marilu sat next to him, and I sat on the other side. I don't know if they're still as friendly as they were before the fallout, but I hope they're at least on amicable terms. They had been close friends for years prior to Disney's acquisition of Lucasfilm and made several of my favorite films together. I hope they have found peace with one another. And in a development that shook heaven itself from its cloudy foundations, even Simon Pegg has expressed some regret over his behavior.
And I must admit, watching the last Star Wars film, the overriding feeling I got when I came out was, I miss George Lucas.
I'm good. I've had a few things to work through, you know.
With Sarah?
No, with George Lucas.
For all the complaining that I'd done about him in the prequels, there was something amazing about his imagination, and I think he's a real first adopter. He saw CG as this way of realizing his own imagination, not realizing that it might actually end up looking a bit, you know, flat and empty. That was not his intention, and I don't think he was being lazy by using too much CG. He just wanted to...
it was a desire just to fill every single inch with something
with
that
stuff.
had been thought about.
And I feel so ashamed of the fact that there was actually a human victim in that. I think most people were regarding Jar Jar Binks like he was a real creature and wailing on him for being annoying or whatever, or not liking him. But there was a person behind that. And I read that and just thought, Christ, you know, I'm one of those people. It makes me feel awful.
As someone who kind of was, you know, kicked off about the prequels when they came out, the Star Wars fan base really seems to be the most kind of toxic at the moment. I'm probably being very controversial to say that. I mean, I'm out of it now. I've apologized for the things I said about, you know, Jar Jar Binks, because of course there was a fucking actor involved there, and he was getting a lot of flack, and it wasn't a camp rabbit, it was a human being,
right?
And because it got a lot of hate, he suffered, you know, and I feel terrible about being part of that. You know, in Spaced, in our comedy show, my character was always ragging on those films, but really that was just me talking about how much I didn't like them.
Forgive me for being glib, but gosh, Simon, that's really big of you. I'm so glad that after 15 straight years of being so astonishingly crass about the prequels, after saying that George Lucas committed infanticide, that you have no respect for anyone who thinks these films are good, after making an entire television show just so you could have a safe space to pretend to scream at children for liking Jar Jar, you finally, at the age of 48, realized that Jar Jar was played by an actor. What brought on such intense soul-searching? Could it be that the hate mob was now harassing actors that you yourself had worked with and was in reaction to the film that you had direct input in the story of? Did that finally make you understand why this behavior was inappropriate?
And I think also back in the day when he was making the first films, there was a Gary Kurtz and Alan Ladd Jr. There were these producers that were there to kind of rein in his incredible sort of miasmic imagination.
I mean, the technology part of the whole thing was completely over my head, but I just believed in him and his genius.
And I think there were people there just keeping it nice and restrained. And those first 3 films were the product of real collaboration. And then with the prequels, it was like, do what you want. And without someone to steer him in the right direction, it did overflow into sort of slightly muddled, kind of less elegance.
Oh, you're still full of crap. Never mind. As I was finishing up the writing for this video, Revenge of the Sith saw one of the most successful theatrical re-releases ever. I had already had the entire manuscript for this video finished, and about half of the video editing done. I just had yet to record most of the actual voiceover. Fun fact, my video essays are not written or recorded or edited in anything resembling a linear fashion. Much like George Lucas himself, interestingly enough, over the course of making these Star Wars videos, I've developed a rather non-linear workflow that involves doing the video editing alongside the writing before I record any of my voiceovers, so that I can have more clarity in how both parts of the process of communicating my ideas work well together. Anyway, to my absolute delight, the discourse around Episode 3's re-release has confirmed for me why Lucas's approach to Star Wars was so artistically successful and why his films have had such staying power. Each time Lucas made a new film in the series, what one learns in that new film ripples back into how they understand the previous films. The moment where Darth Vader reveals that he is Luke's father changes how one understands their interactions before that. The scene where Luke sees Vader's severed mechanical limb and compares it to his own changes how one understands every previous scene that this one is referencing. And this same principle is true for pretty much every shot and sequence in the films. Lucas's saga has endless rewatchability because new layers emerge each time you watch them. This is why some fans have had such a resistance to the prequels. They didn't want to have their understanding of Star Wars be affected so much by what the prequels added to the narrative.
Agree with you, the Council does. Your apprentice, Skywalker, will be. The boy you trained, gone he is, consumed by Darth Vader.
But this is what makes it so ironic when some fans say that you can just skip The Phantom Menace when you watch the film, suggesting that nothing in that film is necessary to the rest of the story of Star Wars. Obviously this isn't true. As we explored earlier, that first film is crucial to understanding that Anakin's emotional attachments are the fundamental flaw of his that will drive his undoing, and that his aspirations of wanting to become a Jedi to save the people he loves, when contrasted with the reality that being a Jedi means being able to let go, and that Anakin has such a hard time doing that, all of this is necessary for the story of Star Wars, and it obviously affects how we're going to feel when Luke finally sees the face behind the mask.
Son, my place is here. My future is here. It is time for you to let go.
Let her go, Anakin! Let her go.
Use the Force, Luke. Let go.
I feel the conflict within you. Let go of your hate.
Go, my son. Leave me.
No, you're coming with me. I'll not leave you here. I've got to save you.
You already have.
What people like Abrams and his friends and their fans are really saying when they try in vain to make the prequels not a necessary part of Star Wars is that they don't want their understanding of Star Wars to change.
I don't want things to change.
The films they made are what happen when Star Wars is made by people who don't accept the complete story that Lucas told, but they also show why Lucas's films have had such sustaining power in the public consciousness while the sequel trilogy won't. Aside from a disproportionately loud part of Gen X and a few stragglers from following generations, the vast majority of people nowadays have demonstrated their eagerness to watch George Lucas's Star Wars as a complete story.
I became progressively obsessed with the finale to Revenge of the Sith. How tepid contemporary art seemed compared to the passionate quality of this finale with this huge musical score that was recorded at the Abbey Road studio, in London. I say it's like a black mass, and so on. And you're getting this tremendous duel that's like dance theater, the longest duel ever filmed. Okay, is this duel, and it is no computer speeding up. Okay, these two actors. Okay, Hayden Christensen and Ewan McGregor, they did that, and for months they learned this sword play. It's absolutely phenomenal. It is dance. This is contemporary dance. All right, and okay, so you get this music and the passionate emotion, the two love hate between these two men. Okay, and then Lucas cross-cuts. There's a destruction of the Senate chamber going on the planet of Coruscant. Okay, so you get this theme of the destruction of politics going on at the same moment, and you have the destruction of industry going on.
We had seen the Senate chamber in the previous pictures as this important place for public discussion and policy setting, suddenly being used as the background for a big battle where they're throwing the pods around and they're smashing into each other, using them as weapons. It was nice graphically and a nice dramatic statement.
And then, okay, the revelation after 30 years, how did Darth Vader get born? Who is Darth Vader? How did he end up to be Robot Man? How did that happen? Okay, there it is. We see the handsome, Hayden Christensen as Anakin Skywalker. Okay, again, like he loses his arms and his legs.
Then we could do the second piece where he lands and rolls down. Do you want to do that, or you want to have a stunt guy do that?
I'll do it if you'd like me to.
That's up to you.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, it's just kind of rolling sideways in the dirt.
Well, if you think you'll see my face and it's worth having me do it, then
probably.
I'm happy to do it, yeah.
And then finally his broken body is taken, it's surgical droids putting him together. Luke and Leia are separated because no one knows they exist, okay? Separated, and they're taken to distant planets. And one is a beautiful planet based on Switzerland, okay, and it is footage of Switzerland with like mountains and valleys, And the other one is a desert planet. Planet was Tatooine with its double suns and so on.
So whenever I see speculation online about whether or not these films are going to get the same reappraisal that the prequels got, my belief is that they never will. J.J. Abrams, Rian Johnson, Bob the Weatherman, and Kathy Kennedy designed the sequel trilogy specifically so as to not build on the previous films at all. So don't worry about trying to find ways to love the Star Wars sequel trilogy, but also don't lament the Star Wars sequel trilogy. Instead, simply recall what I said at the start. There is no Star Wars without George Lucas.
What if someone else beside you came to you and said, I want to make episode 7? Could you see that happening?
No.